The last normal moment of Susan Powell's life looked exactly like this. A quiet Sunday evening in December, her two little boys fed, bathed, and tucked into bed, the house settling into the kind of stillness that only comes after children fall asleep. She had no reason to believe she wouldn't wake up the next morning. She had no reason to say a proper goodbye, to hold her boys a little longer, to leave any kind of trace of herself behind. But somewhere between that ordinary, tender Sunday night and the cold, gray light of Monday morning, someone made sure she never got the chance. Her husband would later tell police he had taken the children camping, at midnight, in the Utah desert, in the middle of winter, and when he returned, Susan was gone. Nobody believed him. But believing him and proving otherwise, as this case would devastatingly show, turned out to be two entirely different things. Her name was Susan Powell. She was 28 years old, a mother, a daughter, a woman who deserved so much more than what she got. That was 16 years ago. She has never been found. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from right now. To truly understand what happened to Susan Powell, you first have to understand the world she lived in, and more importantly, the world she had been quietly trying to endure long before the night she disappeared. West Valley City, Utah, in December of 2009 was the kind of place that looked exactly like safety. A sprawling suburb sitting just southwest of Salt Lake City, built on wide roads and quiet routines. The kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors by name, where children played in front yards while dinner was being made inside, where nothing dark was supposed to take root. And yet, behind one of those perfectly ordinary front doors, something had been growing in the shadows for years. Susan Cox was born on October 16, 1981, in Puyallup, Washington, the eldest daughter of Chuck and Judy Cox. Everyone who knew Susan described her the same way: warm, devoted, the kind of person who held the people around her together without ever asking for anything in return. She remembered birthdays. She showed up when things got hard. She had a laugh that people remembered long after she was gone. She was, by every account, someone who made the world feel a little more bearable simply by being in it. She met Joshua Powell when they were both teenagers, and they married in 2001. By December of 2009, they had built what looked, from the outside, like a quiet and ordinary family life. 2 sons, Charlie, who was 7, and Braden, who was 5, a house in a suburban neighborhood, and a daily routine that gave no outward sign of what was happening behind closed doors. But those closest to Susan had begun to sense something was wrong long before she vanished. She had grown quieter over the years, more careful with her words, more guarded in the way she spoke about her marriage. She kept a private journal, and in it she wrote things that would later stop investigators completely cold, about financial control that left her feeling trapped, about a husband whose behavior had grown unpredictable and frightening, about a marriage that had slowly hollowed out the life she had hoped to build. And buried within those pages was a single line, written long before December 2009, that would become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. She wrote that if anything ever happened to her, they should look at Joshua. She knew. On some level, Susan Powell already knew, and she wrote it down because she wanted someone, someday, to find it. Nobody outside those journal pages knew any of that yet. What the world knew in December of 2009 was simply this: Susan Powell was 28 years old, she was a mother, and she had tucked her boys into bed on a cold winter night. By morning, she was gone. It was Jennifer Graves, Joshua's own sister, who first sounded the alarm. On the morning of Monday, December 7, 2009, she called West Valley City Police after Joshua showed up to work that day and casually mentioned that Susan was missing. Not with the urgency of a husband who had woken up to find his wife gone, not with the panic of a man whose children had been asking where their mother was, but with the kind of flat, detached calm that made Jennifer's stomach drop the moment she heard it. She had known her brother her entire life. She had watched his marriage to Susan up close, and something in the way he delivered that information, so measured, so unbothered, told her immediately that something was deeply wrong. She did not hesitate. She picked up the phone and called the police herself because her brother had not. When officers arrived at the Powell home on Sarah Circle, they found a house that raised more questions than it answered. Susan's purse was still inside. Her cell phone was still inside. Her car was still parked outside. Nothing that a woman would voluntarily leave behind if she had chosen to walk away from her life was missing, and yet Susan Powell was nowhere to be found. What officers did notice almost immediately was something harder to photograph and harder to explain away. The interior of the home smelled strongly, overwhelmingly of cleaning products. Not the ordinary background scent of a tidy house, but the sharp, aggressive smell of something that had been cleaned with deliberate intensity, recently and thoroughly. Investigators noted it. They did not yet know what it meant, but they noted it. Joshua Powell, when he finally spoke to police, had offered an explanation for his whereabouts that investigators would describe, in the weeks that followed, as one of the most implausible alibis they had ever encountered. He told them that on the night of December 6th, sometime around midnight, he had decided to take his two young sons, aged 7 and 5, on a spontaneous camping trip into the West Utah desert near Simpson Springs, roughly 2 hours from their home. He said the boys had been sleeping, that he had woken them up, bundled them into the minivan, and driven out into the freezing desert in the dead of night. He said they had roasted marshmallows. He said they had looked at the stars. He said it had been, by all accounts, an ordinary family outing. When investigators pointed out that temperatures that night had dropped well below freezing, and that the boys had reportedly still been in their pajamas, that no father wakes his sleeping children at midnight on a Sunday to go camping in a blizzard, Joshua Powell did not waver. He did not stumble. He simply repeated his story, calmly and consistently, and said he had nothing further to add. West Valley City Police opened a formal missing persons investigation within hours. In the days that followed, investigators began to piece together the last known movements of Susan Powell, speaking to neighbors, friends, family members, and colleagues in an effort to construct a timeline of her final hours. What they found painted a picture that was deeply troubling. Multiple people who had been in contact with Susan in the days and weeks before her disappearance described a woman who had been quietly frightened. Not dramatic about it, not openly crying for help, but frightened in the way that people are when they have been living with something for so long that fear has simply become part of the furniture. Her sister-in-law, Jennifer, the same woman who had called the police, confirmed that Susan's marriage had been deeply unhappy, that Joshua had been controlling and emotionally unpredictable, and that Susan had confided things that, in hindsight, read as the careful disclosures of a woman who was trying to leave a paper trail without fully acknowledging, even to herself, what she might be leaving it for. Forensic teams swept the Powell home and found evidence of blood, small in quantity but present, and in a location that was inconsistent with any innocent explanation Joshua could offer. They found the remnants of that aggressive cleaning effort that had struck officers on the first walkthrough. They examined the family's minivan and found details that would later become significant. And they found Susan's journal, those private, handwritten pages in which she had, in her own words and in her own hand, told anyone who might one day read them exactly where to look. Investigators read the line she had written about Joshua and understood, with a cold and settled certainty, that they were not looking for a woman who had chosen to disappear. They were looking for a woman who had been taken. Within days, the case had captured national attention. Susan Powell's face was on news broadcasts across the country. Her family held press conferences, pleading for information, pleading for anyone who knew anything to come forward. Joshua Powell sat beside them at one of those early press conferences, dry-eyed and composed in a way that those watching on television found deeply unsettling. He spoke about missing his wife. He expressed hope that she would come home. And then, when the cameras stopped rolling, he went back to the house on Sarah Circle, and he said nothing more. From the very first hours of the investigation, West Valley City detectives operated under a working theory that they could not yet say out loud that Susan Powell had not disappeared voluntarily, that she had not walked away from her children, her family, and her life of her own free will, and that the man sitting in that house on Sarah Circle, calmly repeating his camping story to anyone who asked, knew exactly what had happened to her. The challenge was not forming that theory. The challenge was building a case strong enough to act on it, and in the weeks, months, and ultimately years that followed, that challenge would prove to be one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking obstacles in the history of Utah law enforcement. Investigators began with the desert. If Joshua's story placed him and his sons in the Simpson Springs area of Utah's West Desert on the night Susan disappeared, then that desert was the first place they needed to look. Search teams were deployed across the remote, rugged terrain, on foot, by vehicle, eventually by air. The West Utah desert is not a gentle landscape. It is vast, cold, largely uninhabited, and riddled with abandoned mine shafts that descend hundreds of feet into darkness, the kind of terrain that swallows things whole and gives nothing back. Investigators searched mine after mine, lowering cameras and equipment into shafts that had not been touched in decades, looking for any sign of Susan Powell in places where, if she had been put, she might never naturally be found. They found nothing, but the absence of evidence in that particular landscape, investigators noted carefully, was not the same as the absence of a crime. The desert was simply too large, and the mine shafts too numerous, for a thorough search to ever be truly complete. Back in West Valley City, the forensic work continued. The blood found inside the Powell home was processed and confirmed to be Susan's. The quantity was not enormous, but its location was significant, found in an area of the home that, combined with the aggressive cleaning that had clearly taken place, suggested to investigators that something violent had occurred in that house before Joshua loaded his sons into the minivan and drove into the desert. The cleaning products that had overwhelmed officers on their first walkthrough had done their job well enough to eliminate much of what might have been there, but not well enough to eliminate everything. Forensic investigators also turned their attention to the family's minivan, examining it for trace evidence that might place Susan inside the vehicle on the night she disappeared, evidence that could potentially support the theory that her body had been transported from the home into the desert under the cover of darkness, while her two small sons sat in the back seat, unaware of what was happening around them. Joshua Powell was interviewed multiple times in the early weeks of the investigation, and each time detectives walked away with the same unsettling impression. He was too calm. Not the calm of an innocent man who trusted that the truth would eventually surface, but the deliberate, practiced calm of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to say and was not going to deviate from it regardless of what was put in front of them. He maintained his camping story without variation. He expressed concern for Susan in language that felt rehearsed rather than felt. He did not cry. He did not break down. He did not do any of the things that people who have genuinely lost someone they love tend to do when they are sitting in a police interview room being asked about their missing wife. What he did do, very deliberately and very early in the investigation, was lawyer up, a decision that was entirely within his legal rights, but one that effectively shut down any further direct questioning and forced investigators to build their case entirely from the evidence they could gather without his cooperation. Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, became the public face of the search for their daughter. They held press conferences. They organized community searches. They spoke to the media with a quiet, dignified desperation that was painful to witness, pushing Susan's story into the national conversation and refusing, absolutely refusing, to allow her case to go quietly cold while the man they believed had taken their daughter continued to live freely. They were vocal about their suspicions regarding Joshua. They did not hedge their words or soften their accusations out of legal caution the way investigators sometimes had to. They said, plainly and repeatedly, that they believed Joshua Powell had killed their daughter, and they wanted the world to know it. It was a position that put them in direct and agonizing conflict with Joshua, who retained custody of Charlie and Braden throughout the early period of the investigation, a reality that Susan's parents found not just painful, but genuinely dangerous. In December of 2011, roughly 2 years after Susan's disappearance, the investigation took a turn that added an entirely new and disturbing dimension to an already deeply troubling case. Joshua had moved himself and his sons to Puyallup, Washington, to live with his father, Stephen Powell, a man who had always been a peripheral and unsettling figure in the background of the investigation. When police executed a search warrant on Stephen Powell's home, What they found had nothing directly to do with Susan's disappearance, but everything to do with the environment in which Joshua Powell had been raised and in which Charlie and Braden were now living. Stephen Powell was arrested on charges related to child pornography, and among the materials discovered in his home were images of Susan Powell, taken without her knowledge or consent. Images that revealed a deeply disturbing obsession with his own daughter-in-law that Susan had apparently been completely unaware of. Stephen Powell was ultimately convicted and sentenced to prison, and his arrest had an immediate and critical consequence for Joshua. Child Protective Services moved swiftly to remove Charlie and Braden from his custody while the investigation into the home environment was ongoing. I need you to stay with me for the next part, because this is where the case gets complicated in a way that will frustrate you. While you're here, share this video. Send it to someone who loves true crime. Every share puts pressure on stories like this to stay alive. The custody battle that followed became one of the most critical and ultimately catastrophic threads in the entire Susan Powell case. Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, fought vigorously for custody of their grandsons, arguing that the boys were not safe in Joshua's care, and that his status as the sole person of interest in their mother's disappearance made him an unsuitable guardian, and that the environment in Stephen Powell's home had already exposed the children to harm. Child Protective Services conducted assessments. Social workers were assigned to the case. Supervised visitation was ordered, meaning that Joshua could only see his sons under the direct observation of a caseworker, a measure that felt, to those following the case closely, like an acknowledgement that the authorities shared the family's concerns about the boys' safety, even if the legal system had not yet found a way to act on those concerns more decisively. On the psychological front, investigators and behavioral analysts who reviewed Joshua Powell's conduct throughout the investigation identified a profile that was consistent, a deeply concerning, and maddeningly difficult to translate into a courtroom. He displayed none of the outward markers of grief. He made no public appeals for information about Susan's whereabouts. He did not engage with the search efforts in any meaningful way. He did not, at any point, behave like a husband who was desperate to find his missing wife. Instead, he maintained the surface appearance of cooperation while systematically avoiding any action that might produce new evidence, a pattern of behavior that investigators recognized as consistent with consciousness of guilt, but which defense attorneys could just as easily frame as the behavior of a man who had been unfairly targeted and was protecting himself from a rush to judgment. Without a body, without a confession, and without physical evidence that could definitively place Susan's death at Joshua's hands, the psychological portrait, as damning as it was, remained exactly that, a portrait, not a prosecution. Years passed. The searches of the West Desert continued periodically, each one producing the same result, nothing. Tips came in from across the country and were carefully followed up, each one ultimately leading nowhere. The investigation remained technically active, but the painful reality was becoming harder and harder to avoid. Without Susan's body, prosecutors in Utah had concluded that they did not have sufficient evidence to charge Joshua Powell with murder. The blood, the cleaning, the implausible alibi, the journal entries, the behavioral profile, taken together, they told a story that was overwhelming in its circumstantial weight. But circumstantial, as any prosecutor will tell you, is not the same as sufficient. And in a case where the defendant had already demonstrated that he would not break under questioning, where the crime scene had been cleaned, and where the most important piece of physical evidence, Susan Powell herself, lay somewhere in a landscape too vast and too unforgiving to search completely, the case sat in a kind of devastating legal limbo that no amount of investigative effort had yet been able to resolve. By early 2012, the investigation had been running for more than 2 years. Joshua Powell was living under supervised visitation, fighting in family court for greater access to his sons, and continuing to maintain publicly that he had no idea what had happened to Susan. Investigators had not given up. Susan's family had not given up. The case was still open, still active, still being worked on by detectives who had spent years living inside its details. But the breakthrough that everyone was waiting for, the piece of evidence that would finally be enough, the tip that would lead searchers to the right mine shaft, the crack in Joshua Powell's story that would finally give way, had not come. And as February of 2012 approached, Nobody involved in the investigation could have known that the case was about to take a turn so devastating, so utterly final, that it would close certain doors forever while leaving the most important question of all permanently, irreparably unanswered. February 5, 2012 began like any other supervised visitation day. A social worker named Elizabeth Griffin Hall arrived at Joshua Powell's home in Graham, Washington, to drop off Charlie and Braden for their court-ordered visit with their father. It was a routine that had been established in the months following Stephen Powell's arrest. Structured, monitored, designed with the specific intention of ensuring that those two little boys were never alone with their father, without someone present who could account for what happened. The system, on paper, had safeguards. There were people whose job it was to make sure nothing went wrong. And on the morning of February 5th, Elizabeth Griffin Hall was one of those people, standing on Joshua Powell's doorstep with two small boys beside her, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds. Elizabeth Griffin Hall watched Charlie and Braden walk through the front door toward their father. And then Joshua Powell, in one swift and deliberate motion, closed the door in her face and locked it. She knocked. She called out. She could hear from somewhere inside the house the sound of the boys' voices. And then she smelled it. The sharp, unmistakable smell of gasoline seeping from beneath the door. She stepped back from the entrance and immediately called 911, her voice urgent, her body already understanding what her mind was scrambling to process. From inside the house, she heard the boys scream. The house exploded. The explosion and subsequent fire killed all three of them, Joshua Powell and both of his sons, Charlie aged 7 and Braden aged 5. Investigators would later determine that Joshua had used a hatchet on the boys before igniting the gasoline, ensuring that there was no possibility of survival, and no chance that anyone inside that house would make it out alive. He had planned it. He had prepared for it. He had waited until those two small boys were inside the door, and then he had made a decision that was, in its totality, an act of complete and irreversible destruction, of his sons, of himself, and of any remaining possibility that Susan Powell's case would ever reach a courtroom. In the minutes and hours that followed, investigators discovered that Joshua Powell had sent emails to family members and friends shortly before the explosion. Messages that read as final goodbyes, carefully composed, sent at a time when he had already made up his mind about what he was going to do. He did not confess to killing Susan in those emails. He did not answer the question that had hung over the investigation for more than 2 years. Instead, he said he was sorry, that he could not live without his sons, and that he was choosing to end things on his own terms. It was a final act of control from a man who had exercised control over everything around him for as long as anyone could remember. And, in exercising it one last time, he took with him the only 2 people in the world who had been inside that minivan on the night their mother disappeared. The grief that descended on Susan's family in the aftermath of February 5th was of a kind that defies ordinary description. Chuck and Judy Cox had spent more than 2 years fighting for Susan, fighting for their grandsons, fighting against a legal system that had not yet found a way to hold Joshua Powell accountable for what they had always known he had done. They had been weeks away from a custody hearing that many believed would finally transfer guardianship of Charlie and Braden to them permanently. They had been so close. And in the space of a few seconds on a February morning, they lost not just their grandsons, but the last living witnesses to whatever had happened to their daughter, the last thread of connection to Susan that the world had been able to hold on to. For investigators, the events of February 5th represented something almost impossible to fully process. A case that had already been defined by loss and obstruction had now arrived at a point of absolute, permanent foreclosure. Joshua Powell was dead. He could not be questioned. He could not be charged. He could not be compelled by any legal mechanism available to tell anyone where Susan's body was. But whatever he knew, and investigators were certain he knew everything, had died with him in that house in Graham, Washington. The case that had always lacked a body now also lacked a living suspect. And in the strange, terrible calculus of the criminal justice system, that combination of absences meant that Susan Powell's case would remain exactly what it had always been, open, unresolved, and without the one answer that her family needed most. She had written in her journal that if anything ever happened to her, they should look at Joshua. They had looked. They had looked for more than 2 years. And now Joshua Powell was gone, and Susan Powell was still missing. And the case that had gripped a nation was left standing at the edge of something that had no name, not a conclusion, not a resolution, not justice. Just silence, and unanswered questions, and 2 little boys who would never grow up. There was never a trial. There was never an arrest. There was never a moment in which Susan Powell's name was spoken inside a courtroom by a prosecutor building a case on her behalf. The legal outcome of one of the most publicly scrutinized missing persons cases in modern American history was, in the most literal and devastating sense, no outcome at all. The man who investigators had always believed was responsible for her disappearance was dead. The body that prosecutors needed to bring a murder charge had never been found. And the case that had consumed years of investigative resources, national media attention, and the entirety of one family's strength and endurance arrived at its endpoint without a verdict, without a conviction, and without the single answer that made all the other answers matter. Where is Susan Powell? In the weeks following the explosion in Graham, Washington, law enforcement agencies on both sides of the investigation, Utah and Washington, released statements confirming what everyone already understood. With Joshua Powell deceased, there was no viable path forward to a criminal prosecution in Susan's case. Investigators stated publicly that Joshua Powell had always been and remained the only person of interest in Susan's disappearance, and that his death had not changed their belief about what had happened to her on the night of December 6, 2009. What his death had changed was everything else. The possibility of charges, of a trial, of a confession, of the kind of legally obtained truth that families of victims depend on the justice system to deliver. All of that was gone. What remained was a case file, a missing persons designation, and a family that had now lost not just Susan, but Charlie and Braden as well. The searches of Utah's West Desert continued even after Joshua's death, a testament to the commitment of investigators and volunteers who refused to accept that Susan's story was over simply because the man who knew where she was had taken that knowledge to his grave. Teams returned to the Simpson Springs area and surrounding regions, revisiting mine shafts that had been searched before, exploring terrain that had previously been deemed too difficult or too remote to access fully. The Powell family, for their part, had, in the immediate aftermath of Susan's disappearance, actually participated in some early search efforts, a detail that investigators had noted with the particular attention they gave to everything Joshua Powell did. But those efforts had always felt to those watching closely more performative than genuine. With Joshua gone, there was no longer even that. Chuck and Judy Cox continued to speak publicly about Susan's case in the years following February 2012, driven by a conviction that their daughter's story deserved to be told accurately and completely, and that the failures of the system that had allowed Joshua Powell to retain access to his sons, right up until the moment he used that access to destroy them, needed to be examined honestly and without defensiveness. They pursued legal action against the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services, arguing that the supervised visitation arrangement had been negligently managed and that the agency bore partial responsibility for the deaths of Charlie and Braden. In 2014, they reached a settlement, a legal acknowledgement of institutional failure that brought them no comfort and no real resolution, but that represented the only form of accountability the system was capable of offering them. If Susan's story has moved you, if you believe that cases like this deserve to stay in the public conversation, the most powerful thing you can do right now is subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber tells the algorithm that these stories matter, that victims like Susan deserve an audience, and that justice, even when the system fails to deliver it, is worth fighting for. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Susan Powell's case remains officially open to this day. It is classified as a missing persons case rather than a homicide, a technicality of the legal system that feels, to those who have followed the investigation closely, like one of its most painful ironies. Without a body, without a cause of death that can be legally established, and without a living suspect who can be charged, the system has no formal mechanism to close the case as a murder. So it sits, open and unresolved, in the records of West Valley City law enforcement, a monument to everything the investigation found and everything it could not, ultimately, do with what it found. What the investigation did produce, in the absence of a trial, was a comprehensive and devastating public record of everything that had gone wrong, not just on the night Susan disappeared, but in the months and years that followed. The custody decisions that kept Charlie and Braden in Joshua Powell's orbit long after it was safe for them to be there. The legal thresholds that prevented prosecutors from acting on evidence that was, by any ordinary measure of human understanding, more than sufficient to warrant a charge. The gaps in the supervised visitation system that allowed a man who investigators believed had already killed once to gain access to his sons under conditions that proved tragically inadequate. Every one of those failures had a name and an explanation, and every one of them contributed to an outcome that did not have to be as irreversible as it became. Susan Powell was 28 years old when she disappeared. She would be in her early 40s today. She would have watched her boys grow up, would have celebrated birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesday evenings that mean nothing in the moment and everything in retrospect. She never got any of that. And the people who loved her, who have spent 16 years carrying the weight of not knowing where she is, of not having a place to go to grieve, of not having the closure that even the worst outcomes can sometimes provide, are still waiting for an answer that may never come. Somewhere in the vast, indifferent landscape of the Utah desert, Susan Powell is still out there, and the case that bears her name remains exactly what it has always been: open, unresolved, and quietly, persistently haunting. What does the Susan Powell case reveal about the system we trust to protect us? That is not a rhetorical question asked for effect. It is the most serious and most uncomfortable question this case forces us to sit with, because the answer, examined honestly, is not flattering. What this case reveals is a justice system that is structurally dependent on a form of evidence that a determined perpetrator, with enough presence of mind and enough knowledge of the terrain, can simply make disappear. Susan Powell's body has never been found, and in the absence of that body, every other piece of evidence, the blood, the cleaning, the implausible alibi, the journal entries, the behavioral profile, the testimony of everyone who knew her, was rendered legally insufficient by a threshold that was never designed with cases like this one in mind. The law, in its current form, gave Joshua Powell something that Susan Powell never had. It gave him protection. The legal principle at the heart of this case, that a murder charge requires proof of death, and that proof of death is most reliably established through the existence of a body, is not an arbitrary or unreasonable standard in isolation. It exists because the alternative, a system in which people can be charged with murder without physical evidence of a death, carries its own serious risks of injustice. History is not without cases in which individuals were prosecuted for murders that turned out not to have occurred, in which the presumed victim later reappeared alive. The law's caution in this area reflects a genuine attempt to protect the innocent. But what the Susan Powell case demonstrates, with devastating clarity, is that this caution can become a shield for the guilty, that a killer who is methodical enough, who chooses a landscape remote enough, and who maintains his composure long enough, can exploit the very protections designed to safeguard justice in order to evade it entirely. And then there is the question of Charlie and Braden, a question that this case forces us to confront with a directness that is almost unbearable. Those two boys were alive for more than 2 years after their mother disappeared. They were in the custody of the man investigators believed had killed her. They were living, first in Utah and then in Washington, in a household that Child Protective Services eventually determined was unsafe, and that determination came not proactively, not as a result of the murder investigation, but reactively, in response to the discovery of child pornography in Stephen Powell's home. The system did not protect Charlie and Braden because it identified the danger they were in. It stumbled toward a belated intervention through an entirely separate criminal matter, and even then, the supervised visitation arrangement it put in place proved catastrophically inadequate. Elizabeth Griffin Hall was standing on that doorstep because the system believed that a social worker's presence was sufficient protection. It was not. And 2 children paid for that miscalculation with their lives. The failures of the child welfare system in this case are documented, acknowledged, and, in some measure, legally adjudicated, The settlement reached by Chuck and Judy Cox with the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services represented an institutional admission that things had gone wrong. But acknowledgement and accountability are not the same thing, and a financial settlement, however meaningful in legal terms, does not answer the deeper question of how a system staffed by trained professionals, aware that Joshua Powell was the sole person of interest in his wife's suspected murder, allowed those children to remain in his orbit for as long as they did. The answer, when you examine it, has less to do with individual negligence and more to do with the structural reality that the legal system and the child welfare system operate on different evidentiary standards, different timelines, and different definitions of what constitutes sufficient cause to act. Joshua Powell had not been charged. He had not been convicted. And in the absence of that formal legal designation, the child welfare system's hands were, to a significant degree, tied by the same evidentiary void that had paralyzed the criminal investigation. What this case ultimately reveals, beyond its specific legal and institutional failures, is something about the nature of justice itself, about what we mean when we say that word, and whether what our system delivers in cases like this one deserves to carry it. Justice, in the formal sense, requires a process, an arrest, a charge, a trial, a verdict. Susan Powell never got any of that. What she got was an investigation that knew the truth and could not act on it, a family that fought with everything they had and still lost everything, and a case file that sits open in a law enforcement database, technically unresolved, while the woman at the center of it remains somewhere in a desert that has not yet given her back. There are people who will tell you that the system worked as it was designed to work, that the absence of a prosecution in an evidentially incomplete case is not a failure, but a feature, a protection against the abuse of state power. And there is a version of that argument that deserves to be heard. But there is also another version of this story, and it belongs to Chuck and Judy Cox, and to the memory of two little boys named Charlie and Braden, and to a 28-year-old woman who wrote in her journal that if anything ever happened to her, they should look at Joshua. They looked, and in the end, looking was all they were ever able to do. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to think about it seriously, not as a hypothetical but as a real tension at the heart of how we administer justice in this country. If the evidence is overwhelming, if every investigator who worked the case believes they know what happened, if a woman left written instructions from beyond her own disappearance, telling the world exactly where to look, at what point does the absence of a body stop being a legal safeguard and start being a loophole? I want to hear your take. Do you think a suspect should be charged without a body if the circumstantial evidence is strong enough? Leave your answer in the comments. This is a real legal debate with no easy answer. Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.